In this final part of our application, we're going to take care of the random IP address generation algorithm. Because we want to allow the user to generate several random IP addresses, I've used the while loop to keep asking the user if he wants a new IP address from that subnet to be generated. As long as he answers yes, the code inside the if block will be executed, and thus new addresses will be generated. Of course, as we've seen before, to implement such a behavior, we need a continue statement that brings the user to the top of the while loop at the point where he is asked to input y for yes or no, n for no. So after the old while true construct we use over here and the row input function, we need an if block. So if the user enters y, then the code inside if is executed. Otherwise, the break statement interrupts the while loop and the program is terminated. Now let's focus on the code inside if. Notice that first we have a for loop nested inside another for loop, and each of these loops refers to one of the lists we've seen earlier, BST IP address and net IP address. Let's go ahead and see those lists again by uncommenting their print statements. So this one over here and net IP address over here. Let's run the application. Okay, so these lists are actually lists of octets in the network address and broadcast address respectively. Now let's talk a bit about the enumerate function we can see right here. Keep in mind that enumerate returns both the index of an element and the value of that element at the same time. So let's uncomment the print statement in the first loop and see this. Okay, let's run the application one more time. Okay, we should answer yes to this question. Okay, so we got index 0 for the first octet in the broadcast address, which is 1. Then index 1 for the second octet, and so on. Good. Now let's check the same thing using the second print statement. So let me comment this and uncomment this one and run the application one more time. Y for yes. Now this time, being inside the nested loop, this loop will be executed each time the first loop iterates over the broadcast list. So a total of 4 iterations. So 1, 2, 3, and 4. 1 for each element in the BST IP address list. Now let's comment this print statement back and save the application. Okay, so up until this point, we iterated over the elements of both these lists here. Now let's see the logic behind this. Inside this nested for loop, I have an if inside another if, so as soon as the program goes over the elements of both lists and learns their indexes and values, we enter some conditions. Now let me explain the logic within the code below. For the elements at index 0 in both lists, so for equal indexes, that's the first if statement. If the values of those elements are equal, that's the second if statement. Then add that value to the list we created up here, so generated IP, this empty list right here. And this is where we do the appending. By doing this, we are actually adding the network part of the IP address, so the common octets of both lists. Otherwise, if the octet at a particular index in the first list is different from the octet at the same index in the second list, then the program executes these lines of code over here. First, let's focus on the code inside the parentheses. I've used the module called random, which is a Python built-in module, and from that module I've used the randint method right here. What this method does is it generates a random integer between the values given as arguments, including those values. So if you have random.randint of 1, 10, it may generate any number between 1 and 10, including the boundary values, 1 and 10. In our case, we want a random integer to be generated as being the octet representing the host part of the IP address. This number cannot be 300, for example. It must be a valid IP address octet. So anywhere in between the integer representing the network IP address and the integer representing the broadcast IP address. So these are the boundary values we need in this case. Finally, after this number is generated, it should be converted to a string using the str function and added to the same list, generated IP, in order to join the elements of this list into a single IP address. That address will be the random address we need. And of course, after joining the octets together, we should print that IP address to the screen. Now let's uncomment this print statement right here to see the list of octets, and then this print statement right here to see the final random IP address. Let's save the application and run it. Yes. Okay, so we got the list of octets for the random IP address, and then after joining them using the join method, we have the final random IP address we wanted. Let's try this one more time by typing Y again. Okay, one more time. Great. Now, of course, looking at our code, the last thing to do is call the function. And now we are ready to do some testing in the next lecture.